Did you know that God has a long nose? I'll come back to that in a moment. In the Old Testament, it talks about how that God dwelt among his people. And you have the Ark of the Covenant, but you also have the table of showbread. And a better translation of that would be the bread of his presence. And a better translation than that would be the bread of his face. And the reason for that is the face in ancient Hebrew culture was a very important part of the body. You know how a person thinks or feels by their face. You know a person's identity by their face. You know how a person is responding to you by their face. So if you zero up on another part of my body, you wouldn't know how I'm feeling right now. So for example, if you look at my hand, you can't tell how I'm feeling, how I'm responding to you just by looking at that. You've got to look at my face. So that's why that phrase, the bread of his face, talks about God's very nature and how God feels about us. And that's why it says in Numbers, it says, may God bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you. May he be gracious. May you know his peace, and so on. So we have that sense of God shining on us from his face. And that shining is his blessing, his goodness, his goodwill towards us. That's why it says in Corinthians, for God who commanded the light to shine out of darkness has shone in our hearts, to give the light of the knowledge of his glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So because God is exactly like Jesus, we know who God is and how he thinks in Christ. We see it in the face of Christ. We know how God thinks and feels and acts in the face of Jesus Christ. Recently I saw photos of a man who turned 90, and he was a believer. He'd loved God for 70, 80 years. And these photos, his face was just beaming and shining. And it wasn't just because there was a big birthday cake in front of him. He was shining. His face was reflecting the shine of God on him. And that's what I want. I want my face to reflect the shining of God on me. I want my face to shine with God's reflection. I remember a man who years ago I remembered was quite angry. And towards the end of his life, when I saw him, his face just reflected the love of God, the shining of God on him. I remember he was somebody who was not given to hospitality. He found it very awkward. And yet he'd say, can I make you a cup of tea? Is there anything I can get for you? And it wasn't just about the cup of tea. It was that this face was shining with the reflection of God's shine on him. It's wonderful how the shining of God changes us. So, why does God have a long nose? Well, we've already spoken about how you know a person by their face. In the book of Exodus, when it's describing one of the attributes of God, it says that he is long-suffering. The literal translation of that word long-suffering is that God has a long nose, or that God is long of nose. And the reason it says that is this, that when a person gets angry, you know it from the face, but you get this effect. And there's that sense of breath, the breath of anger going through the nostril. So when it says that God is long of nose, it means that he has a long nose, not because he's a liar, that's Pinocchio, that's fairy tale, But God has a long nose, so that means that it takes a long time for the breath of anger to go right through his nose. So you have that sense of God is very slow to anger. So that's why God has a long nose. That's the literal translation. The King James says that he is long suffering. Some of the modern translations says he is slow to anger. But the literal translation is that God is long of nose. So that's part of the face of God. The part of his shining towards you is that he's slow to anger, he's long suffering. Boy, God's been patient with me. Has he been patient with you? That's part of his long nose. And it's a wonderful thing. So no wonder why it says, the joy of the Lord is my strength. So what that means is that whenever you're discouraged, you can look at God's shining on you, God's joy over you, that emanates from his face as he shines on you, as his joy over you, that can bring us encouragement when we're discouraged. So his joy is our strength. That's all part of his shining face on us. And I don't know about you, but I'm glad God has a long nose.